You know, back in the late 90s, there was innovation everywhere when it comes to game consoles, especially as the generations progressed. And we got to a position where the PS2 was so impressive with its ability to render and process 3D images that we actually kind of figured it could also guide missiles. That was the thing. The UK intelligence at one point had to come out and try to put fears to rest on that one. I guess it was a bit easier to spread rumors back then, since it was harder to look up and find things on places like Twitter, but we also didn't spend all day arguing on Twitter. So give and take there, almost a blissful ignorance, I guess you could say. But I did want to talk about one feature on the PlayStation 2 that has kind of been forgotten at this point, partially because Sony did eventually discontinue and they stopped using it at all now with their systems, but it really wasn't used that effectively, and there are probably many people who have never even experienced it, and that has to do with the PlayStation 2 controller and the pressure-sensitive buttons. Well, we're going to take a look at that here today, some of the uses, and also how it worked. So if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure you like it and subscribe if you're new. So as we made the transition from the original PlayStation to the PlayStation 2, the thing that was obvious to everyone, visually speaking, it was a leap. And I know we had the Dreamcast mixed in there, so we were already kind of seeing what visuals could become, but the PlayStation 2, along with its DVD compatibility that made it really a focal point for the living room in terms of the entertainment side, I mean, it was an incredible thing to see, especially in person with some of these bigger titles. But Sony did also focus on things outside of just visuals. The controller, clearly a big thing you were going to be using going forward, and if it wasn't for that DualShock controller, the leap would have been incredible. It probably would have been the headlining thing next to the visuals, because we would have gone from that original PlayStation controller that had no analog sticks at all, no rumble, to this beast of a controller that people still look back on now as their favorite way to play games, and it's technically the setup that Sony has run with ever since. But because that DualShock existed, it just didn't seem like as big of a jump, although there were some features in there that were not present with the DualShock that did make their way into DualShock 2 and affected the way games played, with, I think, the pressure-sensitive buttons having the most potential overall. The idea here being the buttons were actually analog, as in there are different degrees of sensitivity depending on how hard you press, say, circle when you're playing a game. Now, fun fact, the D-pad is also pressure sensitive, and I feel like not many people know that because the focus was primarily on the main four face buttons. I believe R1 and L1, same deal there. It has that degree of pressure as you're moving through it that the system can detect. And I did mention that not a lot of games use it in a very meaningful way, which is probably why there's one big example you can think of right now, and it's the most famous one in terms of games, and that's for Metal Gear Solid 2 or 3. The idea being, if you, say, pull out a gun, you can put it away without having to press another button. And in fact, if you're holding down that button, you say square, you can slowly let off of it, and Snake or Raiden will put the gun away as opposed to just start firing all over the place. But we did have other games used it that kind of went under the radar, like Gran Turismo 3 or 4, because R2 and L2, we didn't have those analog triggers that we eventually got in later generations from Sony. You would use the face buttons to accelerate depending on how hard you pressed the button. And this was good and bad. It was good because it gave us a way to essentially throttle, right? Different degrees of acceleration, depending on what you're doing, going around a curve or anything like that. But it also meant you had to press really hard, or at least with a fair amount of pressure at all times. Otherwise, your car would slowly start to decelerate. The steering also had pressure sensitivity, which means when you're pressing left or right, if you're using the D-pad, it will have a sharper or harsher turn depending on how hard you pressed it. That seems to be the biggest example, though, are driving games. Many of them use pressure-sensitive buttons, and in fact, if you look on the back of the box for a lot of these titles, it has a little section down where it tells you how much space you need on your memory card or how many players it is. It says pressure-sensitive. For example, look on the back of Grand Theft Auto, as it did use those pressure-sensitive buttons when it comes to acceleration when you're driving your car. The Bouncer used it, and it wasn't a great use of it because it affected your combos depending on how hard you would want to press the button, and unfortunately ended up being more of a hindrance when you're trying to string together combos with a bunch of enemies around you. Okami did use it in a pretty creative way for the big mechanic in the title, of course, being able to draw with a brush. If you press and hold the button down harder, you will have a thicker line than if you lightly press the button, where it'll be more thin. SOCOM being a bit more competitive, I was surprised that did utilize it in some fashion, which mostly has to do with crouching versus prone. So if you press down the button really hard, you'll just immediately go into prone, whereas if you're a bit lighter with the press, you'll crouch down. So it doesn't seem like the best thing to have to think about when you're fighting in a big time match online. So let's talk about how Sony was able to accomplish this. And I want to point out, it wasn't just Sony, because Microsoft and their original Xbox controller also utilized pressure-sensitive buttons for their main face buttons, A, B, X, and Y. So it wasn't something that was necessarily specialized for Sony, something that other companies could not do. In fact, there are some third-party controllers that are just now coming out in 2022 or 2023, and it will have pressure-sensitive buttons, and it's because it's unfortunately not as fancy as you might think. First, let's tear down this PS2 controller, which is one that I got off of eBay, and I had the idea of trying to refurbish it as much as I could so that it felt like it would out of the box. Fortunately, just a couple of Phillips head screws. The back does pull off from there, at which point you do want to pay attention to the different shoulder buttons at the top. They have to kind of slide back in, and they have a ribbon cable that goes underneath of the rubber footing at the top. Just a couple screws to then remove the board, at which point we can take a look at what exactly causes this pressure sensitivity to work with these different face buttons. Again, it does go between the D-pad and your main face buttons with circle, triangle, square, and cross. Looking at the rubber feet on the back, though, you can see something a bit interesting. Instead of having a flat bottom to it, as you would have most buttons, which the idea for the button here, you press down and it will create a connection. When you press it, it will then break it when you release, that letting the system know that you are pressing that individual button or direction on the D-pad. In this instance, though, what Sony did was used a curved bottom to it, as well as some modified pads that would work to detect how much of that pad was being pressed down in terms of the resistance. Because when you normally go to press down in a bit of a lighter fashion with pressure, the center part of that curved dome will touch. As you press harder and harder, more of that dome will flatten out and create a better connection, which means, and it is kind of neat, it can detect all the way through that movement. So it's not just when it's light or when it's pressing really hard. That entire way through can be detected. Unfortunately, it just wasn't really utilized in that fashion as much. I guess the racing games would be the best way to display it, or at least have someone experience what exactly that little pressure-sensitive box on the back of their PS2 case means. And it's kind of funny because back then we looked at the PlayStation 2 as being this incredible device that could pull off some of the most amazing visuals, had great sound, and it played DVDs, and features like pressure sensitivity we were kind of curious about. We didn't know how it worked, and turns out it was just a curved piece of rubber on the bottom. Now, after the PlayStation 2 wound down and we had the PlayStation 3, Sony did carry over the pressure-sensitive buttons to the DualShock 3 or the 6-axis controller, but afterwards, when they went to the PlayStation 4, they discontinued that feature and it did not make its way into the DualShock 4. And there are a couple reasons why. The biggest one is the only places I really see it utilized that helped out with gameplay was in racing games, and at that point, we had analog triggers, so it wasn't really needed necessarily for any of the face buttons. And two, I guess it wasn't as reliable of a button press, because to get the entirety of that dome to make connection with the board or ribbon cable underneath of it, you had to press pretty hard. It just ended up being a feature that wasn't utilized as much, I'm sure, as Sony was hoping out of the factory, and it might have been one that was borderline as it was anyway, considering it just never became a focal point for any one game. However, from the engineering side, I think it's pretty interesting to see how they were able to come up with it, and for the games that do support it, and you have, say, an official PlayStation 2 controller, one of the newer third-party controllers that supports it, it's kind of a fun thing to try out and see exactly what made a device like the PS2 or the PS3 fairly unique for its time, as again, it was kind of left behind and not something that's really talked about much anymore. It is indeed a forgotten feature with the PlayStation 2. But let me know what you guys think about the pressure-sensitive buttons on the PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, or even the PlayStation 3. Let me know if it's something you used a lot in different games, or maybe it's something you came across by accident when you rented a PS2 title from your local store, or it's something you really didn't know much about and you just learned recently. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.